In the aftermath of the 2023 NHL draft, fans and analysts alike are debating which teams got the best value out of their picks, which teams made the biggest mistake and reached for a player, and which players inexplicably fell the furthest down the draft. And while everybody has their own opinion on which player was the biggest steal and which one was the biggest reach by each team, there isn't really a good way to know which player was the biggest steal or the biggest reach, is there? Well, that's where I came in. You see, there's this thing called the NHL draft pick trade value chart. It's a tool used by a lot of NHL teams to determine how valuable each pick is when they're negotiating a trade for another draft pick. For instance, if a team was picking in the 10th spot and they wanted to determine what would be a fair value to trade up to pick number 5, this trade chart would tell them that along with their 10th pick, they would need to trade draft picks in equivalent value of the number 12 overall pick to reach the value they'd be getting back for the 5th overall pick. With that in mind, there were literally a dozen sites that ranked every single prospect entering the 2023 NHL draft, so if we take all those rankings and average them, then we have a projected draft slot for each player in the 2023 draft. Take the value of the draft slot where they were actually taken and subtract it from the value of the draft slot where they were projected to go, and you now have a rudimentary estimation for how much value the team that picked them either gained or lost by picking them in that slot. Put simply, I mathematically proved which player was the biggest reach and the biggest steal of the 23 NHL entry draft. So let's take a look at the 10 biggest steals and the 10 biggest reaches of the 2023 NHL draft. With the first pick of the second round of the NHL draft, the Anaheim Ducks selected winger Niko Mijatovic of the Seattle Thunderbirds. And the problem with this is the Ducks took a guy at the top of the second round who most scouting reports said was going to be a third-round talent. Mijatovic's average draft position was 70th overall, which would put him towards the top of the third round. And there was only one pre-draft ranking that had Mijatovic going in the top 35, and some had him going as low as in the 90s or the 100s, meaning there were some scouts before the draft who thought that the Ducks could have waited until the late third or early fourth round to get this guy. Projecting as more of a defensive forward by elite prospects, Anaheim definitely reached for this one. But ironically, one of Mijatovic's teammates at Seattle was the 10th best player in terms of value that was taken in the NHL entry draft. At pick 63, the second to last pick of the second round, the Panthers nabbed Grayson Sawchin, another forward from Seattle who was projected to go somewhere between 37th and 38th overall. In fact, 7 of the pre-draft rankings actually had him graded as a first-round talent, with elite prospects actually having him ranked 13th overall, but almost every single ranking had him going at least in the top 50. So to get him at the end of the second round when he's drawing comparisons to players like Troy Terry and Robert Thomas is an absolutely huge get by the Florida Panthers. Projected to be a mid-second round pick, Tanner Malintic was picked 24th overall by Nashville. Although elite prospects graded him highly, he didn't crack their top 32 and was only rated a first-round pick by 2 pre-draft rankings. It does seem like he has the skills and intangibles to develop into a top 4 defenseman, but in terms of draft value, it seems like this was a reach. Making matters worse for the Ducks and the Mijatovic trade is the fact that right after them, Columbus got some absolutely incredible value by drafting Gavin Brindley. Projected to be picked at the back end of the first round at pick 24, Brindley was compared to Chandler Stevenson in terms of his skill set, and given that Stevenson was just an all-star and won a Stanley Cup, I think Columbus is going to be happy with that for a guy that they picked at the top of the second round. There are some teams that just can't seem to get out of their own way, and the Vancouver Canucks are definitely one of them. At 11th overall, I picked Tom Willander out of Boston University. Now, Willander was still considered to be a first-round pick by just about every single pre-draft ranking, but most had him going in the late teens to early 20s. And because there's such a massive gap in value between those picks, especially at the top of the draft, going off the board at this position was considered a huge risk. Willander is drawing comparisons to Dmitry Orlov, which would make him a good pick if he pans out for Vancouver, but from a value perspective, if Willander was the next guy on their board, the rankings say that they should have traded back, got some extra value, and then picked him in the late teens or early 20s where he was projected to go. And one of those guys that they did pass on was Axel Sandin Pellikka, who slid all the way down to pick 17 where Detroit finally grabbed him. And the scouts' consensus actually had him going between 10th and 11th overall, so that means Vancouver was in a perfect position to trade back, swap with Detroit, get an extra pick or two, and then probably still end up with Willander. Instead, Detroit gets to recoup that extra value that they didn't have to give up to get a guy that most scouts thought could have potentially been a top 10 pick. While Philadelphia got a lot of praise for the player that they picked at 7th overall, with their second first-round pick, number 22 overall, they arguably reached to grab London Knights defenseman Oliver Bonk. The pre-draft ranking on Bonk was 40th overall, meaning he was at the top to middle of the second round, yet Philly elected to draft him in the back half of the first round. And some places had Bonk even rated as a 3rd or borderline 4th round pick, so to take him at 22nd will undoubtedly come back to bite them. And in the first round, the rich got richer because after getting the consensus generational talent #1 overall in Connor Bedard, the Blackhawks also managed to have Oliver Moore fall into their lap. Rated as high as 7th overall by some publications, the average ranking of Moore had him going 10th overall. With elite prospects comparing him to Dylan Larkin, you can expect Moore to be a key part of the Blackhawks rebuilding along with Bedard. Detroit got lucky with Sandel Palinka dropping to them at 17, but at pick number 9, they took a big swing at Nate Danielson, the center from the Brandon Wheat Kings. With an average draft position of 17.5, most people would have been fine with Detroit taking him at their second first-round pick, but apparently Detroit valued him higher than Sandel Palinka and arguably overdrafted him by at least 8 spots. Now, everybody and their mother is saying that this guy was the biggest steal of the draft. Matvei Michkov was projected by a lot of people to be the best or second best player in the 2023 draft, and getting him at 7 overall for the Flyers was undoubtedly a steal. However, his average pre-draft ranking was actually 4th overall, meaning this isn't as big a steal as most people think. It definitely was huge, and I have no doubt that Michkov is going to be terrorizing the Metro Division for the next decade, because that's obviously how things are going to go. But if you think that Michkov was the biggest steal of the draft, I hate to tell you, he wasn't even the biggest steal in the top 10. Now hitting the top 5, the 5th biggest reach of the 2023 NHL draft was taken at pick 28 by the Toronto Maple Leafs. How big of a reach was this? Well, Cohen didn't have a single pre-draft scouting ranking that had him as a first-round pick at all. In fact, most places had him ranked towards the end of the 2nd or early 3rd round, giving him an average projected ranking of 73rd overall, essentially meaning that the Leafs picked him a full round and a half earlier than most teams would have. Especially for a team with so few draft picks, for Toronto to waste one on a player like Cohen when they could have traded back and got more assets and more picks, that does not bode well for the Treliving era. But the 5th best value pick went to my Washington Capitals at 40th overall in the 2nd round, taking Andrew Cristall out of the Colonel Rockets. 6 rankings had Cristall as a top 20 pick going into the draft, and elite prospects compared him to Jonathan Huberdeau in their pre-draft ranking. Getting a guy at 40th who is projected to go about 21st overall is absolutely a fantastic value for the Caps. And I know Montreal fans were all expecting it. Here it is. David Reinbacher is the 4th biggest reach of the 2023 NHL draft. Not as bad as they thought. Reinbacher was pretty solidly considered to be a top 10 prospect, with his average draft ranking ending up around 11. Taking him at 5 doesn't seem like that much of a reach, but given how much value you could get by trading back from 5 to 11, it is really a shame that Montreal decided that they were going to take Reinbacher there. I think he'll end up being a pretty good defenseman, but he's probably not going to be as good as somebody like Michkov or some of the other forwards they could have drafted in the spot. Maybe the deepest value pick of the entire draft, Jaden Perron out of the University of North Dakota, was ready to go around pick 42, but Carolina managed to snap him up at pick 94. And 3 sites actually had a first-round grade on him, so being able to get him at the end of the 3rd round for Carolina is just incredible value. University of Wisconsin product Charlie Stramble was projected to go in the mid to late 2nd round, but that didn't dissuade Minnesota from taking him in the 1st round, 21st overall. Now, there were sites that had a 1st round grade on Stramble, but there were a lot that also had mid to late 2nd round grades, so that's not looking like a good pick for Minnesota. The 3rd best value of any player selected in the 2023 NHL entry draft actually goes to the player who was picked number 3. Adam Fantilli was all but a lock to go number 2 overall, but Anaheim shocked everybody by taking Leo Carlsson. Now, it may seem like a bit of a stretch to say that a guy taken 1 pick later than where he was projected to go is that big of a steal, but consider that the value in trading up from pick number 3 to number 2. Now, I'm all for taking your guy if he's there, and I'm not saying the Ducks made a bad pick because Carlsson was the consensus 3rd overall pick, but Columbus has got to be thanking their lucky stars that they got such insane value at pick number 3. The 2nd biggest reach of the 2023 NHL draft belongs to the Arizona Coyotes, who used the number 12 pick to select Russian winger Daniil Butt. Butt was projected to go late in the 1st round, around 26th to 27th overall, yet Arizona spent a top 15 pick on him, meaning they could have gotten the equivalent of the 22nd overall pick to move down to the spot where Butt was projected to be taken, and no pre-draft scouting report had him higher than 15th overall. The last pick of the 2nd round, Prince George Cougars center Riley Heidt was the 2nd best player in terms of value that any team got in the NHL draft, and Minnesota was happy to scoop him up at pick 64. Projected by most to be taken towards the middle to late part of the 1st round, getting Heidt at the end of the 2nd round is pure robbery on the part of the Wild, because he's going to project to be a very solid contributor for them for a few years. And finally, the biggest reach of the entire 2023 NHL entry draft I'm sorry, Arizona Coyotes fans, but if you thought you were safe, you are not. It is the number 6 pick. Not only did you pass on Michkov, ensuring that he will torment myself and the rest of the Metro Division for the next decade, you passed on him for a guy that some people were mocking going in the 20s. And yes, there were a few people who did have him as a top 10 pick, so they'll lean on that. But his average draft position in the 2023 draft was 18th overall. Taking a guy who could have gone that far down in the draft at 7th overall, not trading back to get additional value is, I'm sorry, why the Coyotes are in the state that they're in. And finally, the biggest steal of the entire 2023 NHL draft is, no surprise, was the Buffalo Sabres managing to grab Zach Benson at 13th overall. If you want an idea of how shocking a drop Benson had, there was only a single pre-draft ranking that had him going outside of the top 10, and that had him going 14th overall. And 4 places had him actually going as a top 5 prospect. Benson reportedly projects as a Braden Point type of player, so managing to get that guy outside of the top 10 is absolutely ridiculous. And a big reason why I expect the Sabres to improve so much next year is not just because they've been so good at drafting, but also because they've gotten so lucky with their drafts. And hey, it's better to be lucky than good, and Zach Benson is going to pay dividends for the Sabres in the future.